Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Independent Socialists in Wellingborough Zoom meeting this evening on the 26th of March 2026. I'm delighted that this evening we've got our guest speaker, Jonathan Fuller, or John as his friends call him. People who don't like him call him Jonathan, or if they're annoyed with him, I understand. John describes himself as a campaigner on environmental issues for over 45 years and founded several national campaigns around the environment and issues to do with protecting our world. His current focus is the use of the criminal law in the context of the policies that drive climate breakdown. He's planning a judicial review currently of the BBC's output, and I think Ofcom as well. I think in not policing the output in relation to climate breakdown, and is also working to raise public awareness about the grave threat posed to us, particularly in Britain, but wider afield as well, of the AMOC. You think that's how it's described, the AMOC, which I looked up today because I'd heard of the acronym, but I didn't know what it meant, and it stands for the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation.
That's it.
Which I didn't know. I'd heard of the acronym, and I know broadly what it was about. But we're going to hear more about that later from John, and he's particularly concerned about the AMOC, which is effectively the collapse of ocean currents that bring warm water from the equator, particularly from the Caribbean, the Gulf Stream, to the UK and to Northern Europe. And if that breaks down, as John will explain later, it can have serious consequences. But the title of his address tonight is "It's Not a Democracy if Crucial News is Withheld from the People." And I think that's why John is particularly involved in taking and challenging the BBC and other media outlets for effectively fake news or not reporting accurately on issues to do with global warming. So, John, without further ado, over to you. And thank you very much for coming to Wellingborough tonight.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I live in Southend-on-Sea in Essex, and I'm currently in Sheffield this evening, sorting out some issues with grandchildren, what have you, and you may possibly have a grandchild at some point briefly dart through the room. So if there's a slight disruption, doubtless you'll forgive me, but hopefully everything will be fine. So I've been cracking on at this for about 45 years. I think one of the main campaigns that I got involved in or initiated was a speed limit campaign in the 1990s. Back in the 1990s, the UK had the worst child pedestrian fatality rate in the European Union. And we were killing and seriously injuring more children per 100,000 of population than any other nation in the European Union. And the number of campaign groups were working on this or trying to get government to address it. But the right-wing press, The Sun, and at that time also The Mirror, but several national newspapers were campaigning against speed cameras and any kind of method at all that might slow drivers down around town. And it was so frustrating because politicians just wouldn't budge. And we had a slight pause in our campaign towards the end of the 1990s when the Tony Blair administration came to power, and we had to work on Tony Blair and get him to see whether he would agree to tackle this. And initially, the answer was no. And so I led a group of people, and we did a mass leaflet drop in a Sedgefield constituency, Tony Blair's then constituency. And instead of just writing to MPs and councillors and sending facts and figures, we put out a really powerful, really hard-hitting flyer through loads of letterboxes there. And we were asking the public to think, who's responsible for killing more children, the paedophiles or the politicians who wouldn't tackle this terrible catastrophe of 160 children being killed every year by speeding motorists and tens of thousands of being seriously injured. And within a month of that campaign, Tony Blair changed his policy and said that he would halve the number of children killed and seriously injured on Britain's roads within 10 years. Tony Blair was famous for targets, and that was the target he introduced. And the UK, because we started rolling out more speed cameras, speed bumps, traffic calming measures around urban areas where children were most vulnerable, we hit the target 3 years early, with half the number of children killed and seriously injured on Britain's roads. And over that 10-year period, we'd saved the lives of 540 children. And the two things I take from that, and that is that the media and politicians may not want to budge. They may not want to budge. But if you've got a valid argument and you can prove your argument, then you can make a breakthrough, even if the media, the whole of the media is against you, even if politicians just do not want to budge. But you've got to be really determined, really hard. You've got to hit hard, and you've got to really be willing to tell the truth. And sometimes we're timid. Our language is timid. Sometimes we are embarrassed about saying things that need to be said, particularly around people being killed, particularly around harmed children. And we tiptoe around it. Well, in the late 1990s, we didn't tiptoe around it. We really hit the politicians very hard indeed, and kicked the media too. And I think, as I say, one of the key lessons I took from that was that you've got to be strong. You've got to stand up. If you've got a valid argument and it's about life and death, then you've got to be strong. You've got to be determined. And you ask nicely at first. But if politicians just won't budge, then you've got to be much, much stronger. And that's what I'm trying to do with Climate Breakdown, is to try and get people to be much stronger in terms of their language, because the argument is completely valid. Our argument is completely just. So if I have a quick canter through some of the key facts about climate change, these are the things that perhaps the media, most of the media, are very reluctant to tell the public. You mentioned, Paul, at the very beginning of this, that an expression I always use, if I'm giving a talk, and I've given a couple outside the BBC headquarters, and two of them, were enormous, really very, very well attended, hundreds of people, over 1,000 people at one of them. And I always make the point that you do not live in a democracy if crucial news is withheld from the people that will determine the way they vote. So if the public knew and regularly heard details about the severity of climate breakdown, they would demand action. They would demand more action to try and decarbonise and ditch fossil fuels. Things have moved on now a little bit, in the sense that demand still should be there. We need to decarbonise. We need to drop fossil fuels, and as a matter of urgency. But we now know that extreme suffering is now locked in due to climate breakdown. And so now the shift really is on the basis that here in the UK, we could suddenly suffer massive disruption to our food supplies. So by suppressing those facts and that information, the media is now in a position where it is, by suppressing the frightening facts, the alarming news, they also suppress public demand for politicians to prepare. And that, we argue, is a national security threat. The UK's chief scientific officer describes AMOC collapse as a national security threat. The Joint Intelligence Chiefs, that's the heads of MI5, MI6, GCHQ, they refer to ecological collapse and climate breakdown as a grave national security threat. But the population don't understand that. The majority of people still do not understand that. So, Paul, for instance, you mentioned earlier that you had to go and look up what AMOC collapse is. Well, I would think you may be now amongst 5 to 10% of the population that is aware, basically, of some of the details. It's outrageous. The vast majority of people in the UK don't know what that is and don't understand the implications of it. I'll touch on it. I won't go too heavily into the science, but I will touch on that this evening.
So the argument
Sorry, was that a question, or was that just a? It may just be an aside. I think that's okay. So I'll carry on. So if I quickly have a canter through, give you some details, I'm going to refer to some facts and figures. If you go on the mediarevolution.org website, there's a Media Tell the Truth tab. And what I'm going to refer to is I provided that information from the Media Revolution group. So I'm going to refer to hyperlinks that are, or articles, information that is there on that website. So it's quite easy for you to look at now what I'm going to run through. And what I'm going to kick off with, I think, is the idea that, and this is really important for socialists, is the idea that the poorest people on the planet are being kicked the hardest. The people who've done the least to cause climate breakdown are suffering the most. And it is a huge level of suffering. I mentioned, first of all, in 2023, there were record-breaking floods in Pakistan. It's a completely unprecedented scale of flooding that had happened. A huge area of the country ended up underwater. And it's believed that 33 million people were impacted by those floods. And 8 million people were actually displaced, as well as close to 100,000 people being killed. A huge amount of damage done to livestock, millions of livestock killed, animals killed. Some months later, when media organisation went back to see what the aftermath was, that about 9 months later, there were still hundreds of thousands of people that had been permanently displaced who couldn't go back to their homes. It was still underwater. And this had lasted for a huge period of time. The British Red Cross report that during 2023, there was the other extreme of climate breakdown, massive floods and then unprecedented droughts. And there'd been a huge drought across the Horn of Africa in 2023. And they said that 150 million people had been impacted by that drought. And again, a figure of about 100,000 people have been killed. And infant mortality really did begin to soar. The most vulnerable are the people who suffer and die. And it is such a terrible tragedy that it's people just starting out in life, tiny little children, infants who are most likely to be killed. And then, of course, also the elderly. So there was, in Pakistan, you get these record-breaking floods, and in the Horn of Africa, record-breaking drought. In 2024, this was the world's hottest year, when we got close to 1.6 degrees Celsius of global heating. The World Meteorological Organization said that was the hottest year so far. We're expecting 2027 perhaps to be hotter than that. And there have been 151 climate disasters that were completely unprecedented. These were never happened before. And there have been 550 record-breaking floods, heat waves, and storms made worse by climate change. They said that 800,000 people had lost their homes. So with more heat, comes more death. And every year, the Lancet, well-respected medical organisation, publication, research institution, publish the countdown reports on climate change. And you can see it on their website. It's quite easy to look up. Also, it's on the Media Revolution page that I mentioned a minute ago. And they catalogue millions of people suffering the ill health effects of climate change. They have a section on infant mortality, and it's just horrendous. And that's the people now being killed and suffering ill health as a result of extremes of drought, extremes of heat, record-breaking heat waves, and record-breaking floods. In going back quite some years, in 2012, there was the first indication really that about infant mortality and the number of children being killed by climate change. A number of nations that suffer the effects of climate change, suffer the worst, commissioned a report from a group called DARA International, not well known in the UK, but it was a very detailed report. that was submitted to the United Nations on the behalf of these nations that saw themselves as the primary victims of climate change. And they were losing billions of pounds in income, in GDP. And the report found that 360,000 infants were being killed every year by climate change. And the media released associated with that said that's virtually 1,000 children a day being killed. And I think this is one of the most painful issues for any media organisation to actually discuss. How do you have a discussion on TV around what are the moral implications of killing 1,000 children a day? You know, there's no way you can picture the BBC or ITV interviewing Heathrow executive, and the Heathrow executive say, we're going to build this third runway and double our aviation capacity, and we're going to massively increase our greenhouse gas emissions. Well, can you picture a BBC presenter saying, well, so killing 1,000 children a day isn't enough for you? Sometimes there are issues that are thrown up by this that are incredibly difficult to confront. And I would argue that just because it's hard, just because it's embarrassing, just because it's upsetting, we have no right to ignore it. The BBC has no right to cover it up. Quite rightly, over the last few days have been weeks, particularly since the Mandelson thing broke, there's been a lot of information on BBC and ITV in connection with the Epstein affair. And Newsnight does quite a fair bit on that, rightly so. But I would say that here we're talking about a paedophile who harmed perhaps hundreds of young women. And yet, when it comes to the killing of 1,000 infants a day, that can't be discussed. Nobody on the BBC will discuss that. That won't be discussed anywhere on the BBC. And yet it's well understood by the medical professionals who specialise in this field. Not just the United Nations, but as I say, the Lancet. So if we then jump forward to thinking about things that could actually impact us here in the UK. In 2023, the head of the Environment Agency held a press conference. He was really concerned about the impacts of climate change on food security here in the UK. And he started his speech with the idea that we have to either adapt or die. And the news release was issued on that basis, adapt or die. And it was really powerful speech, warning that the UK is not prepared for extremes of climate, extremes of drought. We won't be able to irrigate all our crops. And then you'll have periods of times where fields are flooded, and with it, it's almost like, within, perhaps he was thinking that by 2050 we would have these kinds of problems, but they're emerging now. We're already seeing this right now. We're seeing extreme damage done to crops as a result of flooding, with crops just the roots are just beginning to rot in fields because of extreme flooding. And DEFRA, a couple of days ago, there was a report published by DEFRA that showed that there was a risk of a breakdown in UK food supplies by 2030. The Joint Intelligence Chiefs, that's the head of MI5, MI6, GCHQ, they did a report on the threats of climate change back in October. It was due to be released in October 2025. That's a grandchild just going through. The report was due to be published in October 2025. And for some reason it wasn't. It didn't appear. The Guardian became aware of it. I think maybe a couple of journalists may have been alerted to the fact this thing was due to be published. And it then emerged that the Labour government decided it was too frightening, too alarming to publish, and they wanted to suppress it. And there were a number of freedom of information requests issued. I'm currently going ahead with one myself. But the report eventually was published in January. I think it was January. I'd need to check that. But it was published this year. but in an edited version. And there was quite a fair bit of information redacted, removed from that report. It was issued on the DEFRA website. And it is alarming. It is alarming material. Now, the BBC did put a brief report about that on its website, but it didn't appear in any of the major news bulletins. And so the vast majority of people on both BBC and ITV would be unaware of it. I complained quite a bit to ITV. I changed to ITV quite a bit over this, and then they surprised me. They did do an article on it. But not at the time of the publication, but it was a couple of weeks later, and you can see clips of that which I put on my Facebook page. So I was really pleased that ITV they were slow to move, but they did actually do something on it. And ITV's message was their correspondent just in a 5-minute segment wrapped up at the end that the reason why government doesn't want the public to know about it is because government doesn't have a plan. They do not have a plan that is going to feed us or feed the majority of the population in the event that some of these things that have been warned of by the heads of MI5 and MI6, if they do come about, government is just not prepared. It doesn't have a plan to feed the people in the event of the calamities that were set out. Yes, I'll briefly take one aside there just to say that after publication, myself, a few other people, I've been trying to get people to issue freedom of information requests to DEFRA to see the whole report. And that was refused very quickly by DEFRA. And so that's now gone on to the Information Commissioner. So myself and others, we've got an appeal lodged with the Information Commissioner. A key point I'm making to the Information Commissioner is the government says that it will not confirm or deny that full report exists, even though the Times and ITV have actually seen the full report. And they say the reason for that is because of a national security threat. And I argue to the Information Commissioner that the national security threat rests with the government's refusal to prepare the nation for calamity. And the government is trying to censor information in order to cover up the fact that it's not preparing the nation for severe disruption to food supplies. So the national security threat is government. It's not release of that report. The release of that report would help to protect national security, and the censorship of it harms national security. So I want to just now give you some of the more alarming details on where climate change globally could go. There was Professor Richard Palmer-Cotton Pearce, I think it's John Pearce. They did peer-reviewed research a couple of years ago on how many people would be killed by 2 degrees Celsius of global heating. And they said it would be around about 1 billion people would be killed. It's very difficult to produce a precise figure, but we know already the kind of extreme weather events that kill and how many people are killed. And they went through about 180, I think it was, either peer-reviewed research documents or reputable sources of information on mass death and suffering. And their reports, which is peer-reviewed, warned that around about 1 billion people would be killed by 2 degrees Celsius global heating. So it's not that as soon as you pass the 2 degrees threshold, 1 billion people just die. That's not what happens. It's over the many decades that follow that we stay at 2 degrees Celsius. Up to 100 years, that's how many people would be killed. So it's a huge and unprecedented level of human suffering and death. And that's at 2 degrees Celsius. And you're probably aware that the trajectory we're on is somewhere between 2.5 and 4 degrees Celsius of global heating by the end of this century. So it looks like now we are definitely heading for at least 1 billion people being killed by climate change. And it's just unprecedented. And you will not see the BBC or ITV report that, because it carries certain implications with it. If people regularly heard news like that, then the implication is that we have to change our lifestyles. We have to decarbonise far more quickly than we would do otherwise. Now, the the Institute of Faculty of Actuaries, just took me a moment to remember their name, they produced a report at the beginning of the year, and their report said that there was a grave risk of 3 degrees Celsius of global heating by the year 2050. And that, they said, carried the risk of killing 4 billion people. So at 3 degrees Celsius, the impacts of climate change are far, far greater. And so a body that specialises in risk, that is their job, that is what they do. For them to warn that there was a risk of 4 billion people being killed at 3 degrees Celsius global heating, my view is that should have been headline news. That should have been the subject of repeated discussions on the Peston Show, whatever it is, on ITV, on BBC Newsnight, on Question Time. There should have been special current affairs programmes commissioned just to discuss the issue that billions of people could be killed on the trajectory that we are on. There is a well-respected scientist by the name of Professor James Hansen, and he has a team of researchers he works with. And that team has said that certain climate tipping points have been activated. And they refer to the energy imbalance of what's happening to planet Earth. And because ice sheets are retreating, sea ice is retreating, we've got a situation where far more energy is coming into planet Earth than was previously reflected. It was previously in balance, and now it's out of balance. And they argue that this is just going to keep on going until the planet reaches a maximum that it can reach in as regards our orbit around the sun. And that would mean around about 8 to 10 degrees Celsius of global heating. They're not saying that would happen by the year 2100 or 2200, but that's the heating that they say is now in the pipeline. The only way to avoid that, they argue, is to perhaps consider geoengineering to artificially cool the planet. But they say, unless we stop burning fossil fuels, there's no amount of geoengineering that you can deploy that could solve that. You know, if you think of the Arctic Ocean, in the summer, in many years, for very many decades, centuries, millennia, in summer, it's still got sea ice across a vast swathe of the Arctic Ocean. And 90% of the sun's energy that comes in is just reflected back up into space. But when that ice melts, it is replaced by open ocean. And from space, that appears black. And so instead of 90% of the sun's energy being reflected out in space, 90% of the sun's energy is absorbed by the ocean. And that is this massive change in what we call the Earth's energy imbalance. Huge amount of additional energy is going into the oceans in the Arctic. Now, one of the factors that we're very, very concerned about, scientists are very, very concerned about, is that because of the pace of heating in the Arctic, which is about 4 times the global average, vast amounts of freshwater are flowing off Greenland as the ice sheets there melt. That huge amount of freshwater is flowing into the North Atlantic, and it is slowing the AMOC. Paul, you mentioned that at the very beginning, that I was going to say something about the AMOC. And the AMOC ocean current brings warm water from the equator past Greenland, up to Iceland, past the UK and Ireland, right through to Norway, and then it sinks. This warm water travels across the surface, and then it sinks, and then it flows right very deepest depths of the Atlantic, and very, very gradually it flows back towards the equator. And that's why it's called an overturning circulation. It's warm water relatively close to the surface of the Atlantic, then it sinks and goes back, and it brings a vast amount of warmth, huge amount of warmth to Northern Europe. Now, without that, we would have a climate much more like Southern Alaska. Here in the UK, our climate would be more like Southern Alaska. And that means that we wouldn't be able to barely be able to grow any food at all. The National Preparedness Commission is a body of scientists and national security experts, and they produced a report a year or two ago, and just over a year ago, and they said that if AMOC collapses, it would virtually end agriculture, arable farming in the British Isles. And again, how can it possibly be that when scientists warn that there's a grave threat of this, how can it possibly be that there's not been a special documentary, an hour-long documentary on BBC or ITV explaining this to the population? And yet the vast majority of people, you talk to anybody in your street, virtually everybody, well, hardly anybody knows. And how can that possibly be? Now, in 2024, they issued an open letter to the Nordic Council of Ministers, and they said that the risk of AMOC collapse had been gravely underestimated. Scientists thought there was only a 10% chance the thing could collapse this century, and they say that's wrong. It's about a 50% chance of collapsing this century. And if we don't commit to all the promises that were made at Paris to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but to the timescale that was agreed, then there's a 70% chance of collapse this century. Now, that means because globally, because of countries like Russia and the United States, and because China and India are not decarbonising quite as fast as we'd hoped, but some countries like, as I say, the United States are adamantly, turning against efforts to tackle climate change. We're not going to hit those Paris COP21 commitments, not unless we do something unprecedented in human history, turning the whole of politics around and taking dynamic action. So it does look like now we're heading perhaps more towards the 70% chance of collapse of the AMOC ocean current. Now, if people were told that there's a 70% chance that anybody in your family under the age of, say, 25 was going to be killed by starvation because we couldn't grow any food, people were more likely to say one or two things. One is, how do I get my children out of the UK so they could go somewhere else, but nowhere in the world would be completely safe? Or they may well say to politicians, what the hell are you doing? Why aren't you decarbonising? Why aren't you getting on with this? Why aren't you pressing other countries to make bigger efforts to decarbonise? And people are more likely to actually say, look, if this threat is that grave, why aren't you doing something? Now, the thing is that there are a number of ways that AMOC is being measured. So this isn't anything theoretical, and it has weakened by 15%. And the direction and the route that it takes as well is changing. And there is no doubt at all that scientists are really worried that AMOC could collapse. I mentioned Professor James Hansen a little bit earlier, and Professor James Hansen says that his team that he works with says that there's a grave risk of AMOC collapse within the next 25 years. So we really do face an unprecedented threat. If we prepared now, if we began to prepare now, growing more food under glass, moving more towards a vegetarian or vegan diet or a low meat diet, so that more of the arable land that we have, we use to grow foods, crops that we can that can keep people alive. Maybe we could prepare. Maybe if the AMOC did collapse gradually rather than overnight, maybe if it collapsed gradually over a few years, and we prepared by the way that we grow our food, maybe we could save many millions of lives. But the fear is that if AMOC collapses, we will be in a situation where we need to bring our population down from 70 million to, 5 million. Maybe if we really worked hard and prepared a hell of a lot, maybe we could feed 20 million people. But it's incredibly difficult to see how you could feed 70 million people. So this is a catastrophe. It's terrifying what the implications are of this. I have been pressing the BBC really, really hard over several months to report on this. But up to now, the BBC is not budged. For very many years, the BBC has refused to report the most alarming facts and news relating to climate change. But we're now sort of gearing up now to go for a judicial review on the BBC. I've been in touch with Lee Day solicitors, and they're keen to take on this case and will help us with this case. We've got the advice of a barrister who specialises in media issues. It's coincided with something else that's happened, which is that the BBC has been under pressure from the right-wing press to greatly reduce the coverage that it gives to climate change. And the BBC has decided that it will undertake its own internal review of BBC's coverage. So I asked the BBC whether this review is taking place, and they didn't reply. And then when they did reply to me, when I said, right, that's it, we're going to go for judicial review, they did reply to me. They said, yes, there will be a review of BBC's coverage of climate change, but they wouldn't say whether they would even consider the evidence that groups like, well, a number of groups would submit, and individuals like me, I would submit. So at that stage, I felt really that's it. You know, we've got a commission, a firm of solicitors who specialise in judicial reviews to pursue this. So, as I say, Lee Day have agreed to do it. They should be issuing the letters to the BBC and Ofcom quite shortly. And then at that point, I can give people a lot more information on what our strategy is. But the first step will be really pushing the BBC very, very hard on this review to say you can't just be internal because you're not up to the job. Maybe you don't even understand the science. So it's got to have external expert opinion, and it's got to have scientific input as well. You've got to have scientists inputting to any review on coverage of climate change related issues. Now, that's the core of what I wanted to say about the media tell the truth, the refusal of the media to convey to the public the scale of the threats that we face. And because they won't convey those threats, we face a massive, unprecedented national security threat. Millions of people here in the UK could be killed. Paul, if you'll forgive me, I just want a quick word about radical climate groups like Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain, Extinction Rebellion. Just a quick couple of things, because it's links to what I've just said. I should say, by the way, that I was arrested twice with the Extinction Rebellion. I'd never been arrested before in my life prior to that. You know, I never even got a speeding ticket in my life. So I go through life trying to be a law-abiding citizen, and I go along to protests and what have you and behave myself and not cause any trouble that would upset the police. But when it came to this, when Extinction Rebellion launched, I thought, you know what, the situation's so desperate, I'm going to have to do something. I'm actually going to have to make a huge sacrifice. And that is, for me personally, it's the idea of deliberately going out, sitting somewhere I shouldn't be sitting for hours on end and be arrested, an act of civil disobedience. So I was arrested beside the pink boat down the road from BBC Broadcasting House. And then I did another protest with Extinction Rebellion that led to another arrest, which the police dropped that case. It was a wrongful arrest, chased them off. But what I briefly want to say here is that, Paul, at the outset, you mentioned there's another strand of work that I'm involved in, and that is using international criminal law in the context of climate change. And there's a website that I've got called climatecriminals.uk. You can look that up. And on climatecriminals.uk, it's called Climate Genocide Act Now. And we submit cases, 2 cases, to the International Criminal Court. One is against senior UK politicians, well, prime ministers, who are responsible for a range of policies that drive climate breakdown. And they do that despite the fact they know that this contributes to mass death and suffering. You're about to become an expert in international criminal law. So in international criminal law, to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, you are not allowed to cause mass death and suffering. A politician's not allowed to do that. Even a business figure is not allowed to do that. And we as individuals, we're not allowed to contribute to it. And Article 25 of the Rome Statute has this notion of you don't have to be the person who individually goes out and kills somebody, who starves somebody to death in Ethiopia. You only have to introduce the policies that contribute to that outcome. Article 30 introduces concepts that a lot of us understand as murder or manslaughter. That's direct intent and oblique intent. Article 30 introduces this concept of you can be prosecuted if you intend to destroy a population, you intend to, because you hate them, you want to kill them all, or if you know that by pursuing a course of action, mass death and suffering is likely to occur, and yet, despite knowing that, you decide to continue. And so that's oblique intent. In law, we call that manslaughter, but both are criminal offences in international criminal law. And what we've said is that it's absolutely clear that politicians can be prosecuted using the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court. And these cases have gone off to the International Criminal Court. And there are other cases from other countries where people are going to the International Criminal Court and saying, you've got to prosecute. You've got to prosecute. And the ICC is a political body, and it doesn't want to prosecute. So it's trying to wriggle out of it. And we keep saying, well, that's the law. That is the law as it's in, in statute. It's clear. And there's something else in there that's really important. Article 25 3F, don't worry, you don't have to remember it, but Article 25 3F says that if in any way you contributed towards this, the only way you have a chance of not being prosecuted in international criminal law is if you attempt to stop the criminal offence, if you attempt to stop the activity. Now, we here, as citizens in the UK, we all benefit. We don't want to benefit from the use of fossil fuels, but we do benefit from the use of fossil fuels. We've had couple of centuries of using all the wealth that comes from burning coal. We have the City of London trading in huge quantities of fossil fuel activities, investing in fossil fuel activities abroad, and bringing vast amounts of wealth back into the UK that helps to sustain the UK, from which you and I benefit. We benefit in terms of the public taxes that help to pay towards our essential public services. So there is a legal obligation upon us as individuals to attempt to stop it. And what I'm working with a number of climate activists in Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil is they're going into court and they're saying, that is the legislation. I'm required in law to act to try and stop the killing. And yet I'm the one who's prosecuted. Now, the police have been asked to mount a criminal investigation using the legislation, but they refuse to do so. So we have a worse situation where the police know that they should act on the legislation, but refuse to do so. The whole of the criminal justice system knows that the police and the criminal justice system should act to stop those who kill. But guess who's prosecuted? Not the killers, the people who are trying to stop the killing. And so it's impossible to have a fair trial in a system like that. It's impossible to have your Article 6 rights of the Human Rights Act, to a right to a fair trial in such an extreme and unprecedented situation. So that's the argument a lot of people, I'm helping a lot of people carry into court, and it really pushes hard back against Crown Prosecution Service and puts judges in very, very difficult position. There's one case that's quite a fair way advanced. And the finances are in place that if that person is convicted, then they can go to appeal. And they can use this CGAN evidence and go to appeal. And if we win on appeal, then hopefully we could begin to unpick a terrible injustice. And we could actually say that everybody that took action to try and stop climate breakdown, their convictions should be quashed. They are not the criminals. They're the people who try to protect life. They're the people who try to uphold international criminal law. They should be celebrated rather than imprisoned. And many of them have been imprisoned. Some have been given prison sentences of over 4 years. And it's just the most appalling injustice. So, Paul, I think I've droned on now for long enough. I hope I've given people quite a fair bit of information, and I've touched on the main areas of work that I'm involved in. So hopefully now people know that mass loss of life has begun, that international criminal law should be applied. The groups like Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain, Extinction Rebellion, they're not the criminals. And I hope that also I've conveyed to you the message that really dynamic action is underway to try and force the media to tell the truth.
Well, what a contribution you've made, Joe. I'm stunned. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for that. what I'm going to suggest is that we now take a break. It's now
Sure.
10 to 8. So if we come back at 8 o'clock, is that okay with everybody? Do I see nodding? I think I do. I'm not quite sure. Just let me go back to my gallery so I can see everybody. Is everybody okay if we take a break now? Come back at round about 8 o'clock.
I won't be coming back, but I told you that, didn't I? Because I'm convalescent at this early stage.
Sure, Kate. Fully understand.
And good to see
worry.
Zara, but I've been in touch anyway.
Yeah.
If
people want to stay on,
thank you, John. It's really interesting.
If people want to stay on the Zoom, that's also fine. Hello and welcome back to this incredibly interesting discussion and information and meeting with John Fuller. We're now going to go into discussion, Q&A, contributions from people if you want to make a contribution. Just to say, if you want to put your hand up, please, if you can, use the react button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, as it's much easier for me to identify who wants to speak. And please unmute if you want to speak. Who would like to pose a question? Or Alan, you're the first in. Okay, so you unmute and speak.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that was a brilliant and chilling presentation.
Thank you.
Which brought me up to date from where I thought I was in understanding all of this. I just want to make a couple of points about language and a more general point, and then I want to ask a particular question. First of all, I think we should say that Epstein and the Royal Andrew didn't harm young women. They abused underage girls.
Yes, I agree.
But more related to this talk, I think it was, and you probably know better than I do, I think it was 2023 that Antonio Guterres said that we should stop talking about global warming or global heating, and we should actually talk about global warming. Because, I wonder if that's a thing to do. The other point to make before I get to the question is that Security Services report that was sort of suppressed and then partially released, they also drew attention to one of the other impacts, other than food shortages, would be mass migration.
Yes.
And that is likely, apart from anything else politically in this country and elsewhere in Europe, it's going to absolutely super drive the far right and the fascists, because they are going to feed on that. My question is the government here and the media not telling the situation as it is because they are afraid that if they did say what it was, there would be more people listening to the eco-socialist argument that the way to stop all of this would be to actually move away from capitalism?
Yeah. Yes, I agree with all of the points you've made there. I don't think there's any doubt at all that this climate breakdown has huge implications, because we just cannot continue to proceed the way we are and avoid killing literally billions of people. And we've never, ever, as a species, we've never faced any kind of threat, anything like that before. So the idea that we're just going to somehow carry on and let the youngest members of our own families just die, that if that truth was conveyed and understood by everybody in the UK, the demands from the population would be overwhelmingly, we cannot carry on like this. We have to change our economic system. We have to change the way we live, and we have to walk far more gently upon this earth. We have to take far less out than we are now. And you can't see really how the economy can continue the same way it has for the last few, 50 decades, 50 years or 100 years. Things have to change, and dramatically so. You cannot have a situation also where there's extreme wealth. There are billionaires on this planet while other people are starving, because that reduces all the choices that people who are very, very hungry or suffering poverty, the choices that they have become very, very limited. And that in itself drives us towards either deforestation or other forms of ecological damage. So inequality itself, I think, is a driver of climate breakdown. And politicians don't want to address that. They really don't. And I think that's a big reason why this is being suppressed. I think you're absolutely right.
Anybody else wish to speak? Tony, please unmute.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. What do you think of the rise of the Greens politically? Do you think that some of the awarenesses that you're talking about are more likely amongst younger people, and that holds out some, if you like, some hope? Do you think that is, do you think it's possible that some of the climate skeptics and the exploitation on the right are conceived, are possibly representatives of older generations that are in some, they're not picking up on the sorts of things you're talking about? Yes, I just think, is there some sort of positives that you want to draw out of the sort of observations about climate awareness that you've been making through your talk? Because and is it just about very important, some of the moves you're saying that should be made legally, campaigning, so forth, but also we sort of I think in terms of the what the sort of polling and so forth indicates at the moment, and what do you actually think, how this May's elections, it seems to me that they're going to mark some sort of watershed. Politics, I think, is very volatile, and there will be repercussions from how people vote in May. Anyway, I'm afraid I've just rambled on a bit there, but you get my drift.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, so there's no two ways about it. The Greens are polling second to Reform UK. So they're best placed, if you like, to really take on Reform UK and try and draw people away from that group. I'm just appalled by Reform UK, the cruelty of it, the selfishness of it, the complete contempt or lack of concern for young people is just everywhere. The Greens appeal to young people because primarily there is a sense that the young feel that they are being screwed. They're being screwed over, whether it be tuition fees, whether it be an inability to afford to rent a home, to get the place of their own, or even maybe buy a place of their own. They feel that these choices or options are being taken from them. Whereas older generations, they had a lot of benefits and that are now denied to the young. And the young have to pick up the tab. They pick up a massive national debt, and they pick up a failing climate. They have to live with climate breakdown. So young people, when they become politically aware, are far more likely to vote for the Greens, because the Greens really have some quite dynamic policies on inequality. So whether it be trying to have rent controls or tackle extreme obscene wealth, the Greens are most dynamic of the political parties on the left. Now, obviously, there are other left-wing parties. Jeremy Corbyn tried to get your party up and running, but it doesn't look like it's going to make a breakthrough. There have been so many arguments. I'm not sure that it's going to make a breakthrough. So a lot of people on the left are just saying, well, look, you know what? The Greens wouldn't be my first choice. Maybe I'd have preferred something else to come through. But right now, that's the political party that gives me 80-90% of what I believe in. And I'm terrified by Reform UK. So I'm going to jump into support the Green Party. And the Green Party's membership, I think, has now exceeded 210,000 members. The point
220,000 they were claiming the other day.
All right. Yeah. So 220,000 members is a huge surge. Now, that is largely due to Zach Balansky. I will just chip in one comment about Zach Balansky, because I am a member of the Green Party. And quite some time ago, I saw a speech that he had done about Reform UK. And I messaged him, I sent him a message, and I said, Zach, I want you to do two things. And that is, I want you to stand for the leadership. And I want you to stand on your own. Because the Greens have had a long tradition of two leaders, a joint leader situation. And I thought the threats from Reform UK are now so extreme that you need a powerful speaker, somebody who will carry a very consistent and powerful message against the hard right wing. So I said to Zach, would he stand on his own? And he did, and he won by a thumping great big majority. So I was really pleased. I was really chuffed. He and I are often in touch. He often shares my Facebook posts, and we're often in touch. I'm a huge fan of his, and I think that for people who consider themselves to be socialists, I would say that there may be some green policies that maybe would concern you, but the Greens now give you so much of the things that you believe in that I would say it's time for compromise. It's time to really get behind the Green Party, join the party, try and get it going, try and help it to make the big breakthrough, not just May elections, but the other elections that come. And when we get through to the 2029 general election, we want the Greens to be in a position to defeat Reform UK. Maybe part of a centre-left coalition that can beat Reform UK. So we stop Reform UK from forming the next government, which I would argue would be a total disaster, not just for climate change, not just for the environment, but devastating for all young people and devastating for everything. I would say everybody in this meeting believes in. Across the board, Reform UK will demolish all kinds of things. They will attack immigrants. They will attack minorities. How on earth members of the Asian community or Black community can join Reform UK, I do not know, because every now and again the truth slips, the mask slips, and you see that is a racist, cruel, nasty organisation full of people who really dislike minorities and would gladly see people with different colour skin kicked out of the country. Certainly they'd start with anybody with a different faith. Muslim people kicked out of the country. And there's a lot of people in Reform UK who would kick Jewish people out of the country. They are really dangerous. So my message to people is, we're going to have to compromise. People on the left wing will have to get behind a party. And at the moment, I'm going to suggest to you, it's the Greens to get behind. I hope I don't annoy anybody in the room for having said that.
I agree. I agree broadly, but I hope that young people will vote tactically, because I think tactics are about what will influence the future. And I hope that the lessons to be learned from May will be, be careful how you vote, don't generalise, look at what the alternatives are, vote to keep reform out.
Yes, I agree with you.
Thanks.
I think I may be chucked out of the party in due course. I may be removed from the Green Party because when we get closer to 2029, if it comes to it, then I will be one of those people who says we have to vote tactically to stop Reform UK. So I may get into trouble for that view, but I won't be in trouble until 2029. At the moment, I'm saying to people, let's really push the Greens as hard as we can.
Just on that latter point, I've been arguing that recently because of local elections in Northamptonshire that the Greens got good votes, but Reform won the election. That was in Corby for those that Reform just won 2 seats, which would have been traditional Labour seats. And I was arguing that they need to have some discussions with Labour in order to ensure that we defeat Reform. But it's a complicated argument to make just when the Greens are advancing.
Yes.
So, and people want the Greens to grow, and they think standing in elections will enable them to grow. So, it's an argument certainly I've been making. But Nigel, you've been waiting very patiently all the way in Belgium to get in and make your contribution. Nigel's one of our long-standing visitors to ISW, all the way from Belgium. That started, I think, during the COVID period when we were online all the while. So welcome again, Nigel, and please have your say.
Okay, good evening. I have to ask a question. I've got one of my oldest friends who, if you would excuse the Brexit reference, got kicked in the head by a horse. And he's a bit like that for climate as well. And he's managed to isolate himself on YouTube and find the relevant videos which back up his point. And he's spent such a lot of time specializing in this that it is very difficult on a short conversation where you don't actually want things to blow up to actually say, what about this? Have you seen this? What do you reckon to this? His reaction tends to be, well, that's what they want you to think.
Yes.
So how do you counter that, please?
I think it's when somebody's got an emotional attachment to an argument, it's very difficult to break them away from it because it's not science-led. The reason for climate change denialism is not science-led. There's no scientific basis for that opinion. What people will do, and the person you mentioned is very typical, they will find something on YouTube that supports their point of view, and then they will share that. They won't find something on YouTube that counters their beliefs. Mainstream science, they won't share that, even if it's the overwhelming majority of scientists who say that climate change is real and it's happening and we have to confront it. They won't share anything like that. Mainstream science, they won't share. They seek out anything that may confirm their point of view. And it is an emotional argument. It stems from the idea that some people don't want to make lifestyle changes and they feel embarrassed about the lifestyles that they lead and feel that they're on the wrong side of a moral issue. If climate change is real and it's deadly and will harm the young, the desire not to do anything about it means you're on the wrong side of a big moral issue. So they can't confront that, and so they will pretend that climate change isn't real and it's not deadly. So it is a pretense. Climate change denialism is a pretense. It's not based on any kind of scientific evidence. We've got NASA, the European Space Agency. They've got all these satellites going around the Earth. We know that various different greenhouse gases heat the planet, and this can be measured with great precision. And you can see it in localized areas where methane is being released from a fracking outfit in America, or methane is being released from thawing permafrost in Siberia. And you can actually see the heating that is occurring as a result of that. So the satellites that are going around the Earth, we know this. It's absolutely certain. We're no longer in a position where we could say that some scientists believe that climate change isn't real and isn't happening. It's really now a case that there is no scientific basis at all for climate change denialism. There's no scientific evidence that would support that point of view. The best that climate change deniers can hope for is that maybe it's the heating that we're seeing might be a temporary phenomenon as a result of weather conditions, where it may be El Nino or a La Nina weather phenomena. But you just can't find scientists now who are reputable and working in universities who would say that climate change isn't happening and isn't due to human activities that put more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So I always use a bit of emotion on people, and I do give people the science, but I also do say to people that we have to show the courage to protect our young. We have to be able to show to our young that we cared enough about them to try and turn this around. And I appeal to people to show that they have a duty and a responsibility to the youngest members of their own family. And if they show the youngest members of their own family that they don't have that sense of duty and responsibility or courage to face something, then the youngest members of their own family will always remember that about that person. So I use facts and I use emotion. And I think that you have to have both, really, to change people and their opinions and their behaviours. And we can push back against Reform UK by explaining that they do not have the courage to protect the young, and they will never find the courage to protect the young. And we have to step up. We have a duty to stop them.
Okay. Alan, you've got your hand up. I think you wanted to reply also to Nigel's question. So if you'd like to say what you want to say.
I'm having a language evening. It's a bit about language. I tend not to refer to Farage's party as he would like it referred to. I take the first three letters and the last two and call it refuck. Again, this is a general question. Would you accept that Farage's party is, in fact, a creeping fascist party as defined by, who was it?
Robinson.
No, I thought it was Neil Faulkner.
Oh yeah, Neil.
Which was shorthand for an authoritarian, far-right populist party that mainstreams some of the ideas, policies, etc., normally associated with outright fascism. But I was interested in what John had to say about the Green Party. Does he or the rest of us here see any mileage in a Green Party, your party, united front against refuck? And I've been encouraged just the last 2 days. I see that Zach Polanski and Jeremy Corbyn have been speaking at a couple of meetings around the country. And I think it was Tony who raised the issue of tactical voting. And I know it's a very tricky topic because in the 24 general election, when it was a race in my constituency between the most far-right Tory MP in the whole parliament, a chap called Mark Jenkinson, who was very friendly with lots of BNP people, and a middle-of-the-road Labour candidate. And I said I would actually be voting for the Labour candidate to keep out Jenkinson. I was accused by one long-term friend of having gone to the far right because I was saying that I would vote Labour because Labour's policies on Israel, Gaza, etc. were so appalling, which they were. And for those who feel uneasy about tactical voting, to keep refuck out, not just in a general election, but any kind of seat. I think Rebecca Solnit said, voting isn't a Valentine, it's a chess move. And I thought it was brilliant that in the Manchester by-election, your party not only decided not to stand a candidate, but actually endorsed the Green Party candidate. And I would just think we do. I think it was John said, we do have to do a bit of a compromise and maybe hold our nose in certain areas and so on. The prime thing is to make sure that Farage and his lot don't get anywhere near political power, even as part of a coalition government. But I'd be interested in your views and anybody else's. That's me done.
I'm just going to bring in Melissa here because she had a question on the chat. Melissa, did you want to read out to say your question, or did you want me to read it for you? Melissa, are you there?
Hi, you're welcome to read it out. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, if I can find it. It's not displaying on my screen for some reason.
All right, I'll do it then.
Yeah, you better do it. I can't find it.
Right then.
Having invited me to do it. Yeah.
So basically, John, is it possible? So it seems to me that the world financial and economic structures mean that it's global corporations that have the power, not governments. So although politics needs to change and accept the climate crisis, I just don't see how global corporations can be worked with, really, how they can be challenged, because if you've got courts that prevent governments from taking action which damages profit margins, then we're a bit stuck, aren't we? Question.
Yes, I agree with you. Corporations are a major obstacle. They fund climate change denialism, and they alter public opinion. They're responsible for an awful lot of misinformation on social media. So yes, they are a huge obstacle. But every now and again, you do find, perhaps like groups like the Confederation of British Industry, the CBI, will say, issue a message to government to say, look, you have got to have policies that decarbonise, that allow us to tackle climate change, to avoid the worst effects of climate breakdown. And so you do find a lot of businesses that can be responsible. Typically, you will see groups like that saying, we want to decarbonise and we want to do it over a gradual period, more like 25 to 30 or 35 years. Whereas the scale of the emergency is so great, we actually need emergency action. We need to apply the emergency brake to stop what we're doing. And that would actually have dramatic economic consequences. So there is a real conflict there, but I would say that most in business, very senior CEOs want capitalism to continue, and they realise that capitalism cannot continue if we have the worst effects of climate breakdown. And I hope that what's happened over the last 3 years is a wake-up call to them, because there has been a sudden spike in global heating. And all weather agencies, groups like NASA, they produce their data on it. It's clear there's been a sudden spike in global heating. So we think, scientists think that 2027 will be a record-breaking year. 2026 will be very hot, but not a record-breaking year. 2027 could be close to 1.7 degrees Celsius global heating because of the El Nino phenomenon. So it's quite possible that a lot of very powerful business figures will realise, this is just unprecedented. We're in deep trouble. We're going to have to accept dramatic changes, and very, very quickly. Can I come back to a point about the previous speaker? Because we were talking about the rise of the hard right wing. Just want to very quickly mention that Reform UK have brought up the idea after the last by-election that some people shouldn't be allowed the right to vote. So if you're born in the UK, you can have the right to vote, but if you migrate to the UK, you couldn't. So they brought up the idea of restricting the right to vote. And there's something else that happened recently, which was Richard Tice saying that he was going to, when Reform UK is elected in 2029, we will not honour certain energy contracts that have been signed by the existing government. So they are trying to undermine democracy, because there's been a long-standing understanding that the government of the day has to conduct business has to sign contracts with the private sector, with business, and give them certainty, so that business can say, right, we'll invest in whatever this project or that project, whatever it may be. Business knows that the government will adhere to the terms of that contract. And Richard Tice is saying, no, the government of the day that was democratically elected by the people, we have no concern for that. We want to overrule that. So the dictatorial stance of Reform UK is clear to see, withdrawing the right to vote to some people and ignoring the rights of the current elected government to govern and make decisions. So this shows you that they don't have much regard for democracy. Mm-hmm. And I think that we really have to treat Reform UK as hard right and as fascists. This is fascism, and this is coming right at us. They pretend that they're not, but I think that we have to treat this as the rise of fascism, and we have to respond to it in the way that many tried to respond to fascism in the 1930s.
Thank you. Could I ask a couple of questions, or make one comment and then a question? Is it possible, following on from Melissa's comment, is it possible that we could use the law to challenge corporations in the way that they have done in America, this case this week against Google and the media companies in respect of harm to children? Yes. I mean, and is that something that you might consider?
Well, the group that I work with, CGAD, we use the criminal law going after individual CEOs. And that's really been the focus of some of the other cases. There was one other one recently by the UK Youth Climate Coalition. They submitted to the case to the International Criminal Court against the individual board members of BP. And so they were going after the individuals, saying that they had committed crimes against humanity. Their case has recently been rejected by the ICC because the ICC said it's not reached the threshold for a crime against humanity. The number of people killed by BP, it hasn't reached a threshold level that would imply a mass death situation. There were no two ways about it. Their activities result in death. And the substantial part of the case was about BP's activities in Nigeria and the Niger Delta. And there was quite a substantial part of the case about climate change. And what I've asked the UK Youth Climate Coalition to do is to go back to the International Criminal Court and say, okay, all right, so maybe that part of our case about deaths, people being killed in the Niger Delta, maybe that hasn't reached whatever your threshold is. But in terms of the number of people being killed by climate change, well, we're talking about millions of people having been killed by climate change, that has to be over your threshold. So I'm waiting to see how that plays out.
Is it possible under UK law, as opposed to, I mean, the International Criminal Court showing itself not only to be reluctant, but also extremely slow. I mean, the case involving the genocide in Gaza is still not reached as a court hearing. And I can't see that being, I haven't seen anything which suggests that's going to be anytime soon. So the International Criminal Court is a very weak instrument. But is it in the United States, they've used US law to challenge multinationals over the media damage to children?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that we are within a whisker of reaching that point. There are a number of campaign groups that are looking at this, and I'm hoping that some of the campaign groups, Good Law Project and Client Earth, we could see a case very soon, perhaps against maybe something like Heathrow, where we can actually now say the number of people being killed by its activities. Earlier on in my talk, I mentioned some research done by Professors Pearce and Parncott. And they said 1 billion people being killed by 2 degrees Celsius global heating. And Professor Parncott wrote to me, and he said that the Heathrow expansion would kill 20,000 people a year at the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. So I actually think that we here in the UK can use that evidence to actually say we should be prosecuting the individuals within here, within the UK, using existing UK legislation, and also taking civil proceedings against Heathrow for the damage that it does to the population.
I mean, my second question is if the AMOC is going to be so damaging to the UK in terms of feeding people and what have you,
yes,
potentially, that reverses the argument, or not argument, but the facts on migration.
Yes,
because British people are going to be looking to go where they could possibly to better climes, if I could put it like that, in exactly the same way.
Yeah, nowhere is safe. But, for instance, if you thought, well, we're just not going to be growing food, hardly any food in the UK. There's no way that 70 million people can be survive this. So, say, for instance, you were a family member of one of the heads of security services who had written that report, the Joint Intelligence Chiefs report. You're a family member and you say, well, I know quite a bit about this because I've looked at the national security implications. I'm going to tell the youngest members of my family to learn to speak Portuguese and to become a doctor and maybe a specialist in a particular field, so that when the youngest member of my family decides that they are in danger here in the UK, they can relatively easily move to Portugal and pick up a job there and would be accepted because they have a particularly useful skill that the Portuguese population will want. So some people will be in a better position than others, and knowledge is obviously crucial. You have to know in advance so that you can plan in advance your exit strategy. But if it comes to the point where millions of people start trying to flow across the channel and escape to, I don't know, mid-France, central France, or northern Spain, we can see what will happen. We know full well what will happen. British people will just be, well, they'll be killed. There'll be fights, there'll be riots. If we put people in small boats and send them over, they'll be sunk. And I think it's really important to say this kind of thing to people minded to vote for Reform UK, because there's no way that if we are brutal and cruel to people who have lost their homes and are fleeing great danger, and if that becomes the norm across Europe, if those attitudes become the norm across Europe, then that's the way our people will be treated. That's the way our youngsters will be treated. Our men will be beaten up and killed. Our daughters will be raped and murdered. And is that the kind of world that we want?
Well, there's dangers there, but there's dangers in those arguments because they kind of reinforce the invasion, the current arguments around invasion into the UK from places like Sudan and North Africa and what have you, who are essentially being driven by climate breakdown to try and come to Europe and Britain. So we have to be careful with the arguments, but I think that there is an argument there somewhere, but that doesn't reinforce the same kind of arguments that are being used currently. But it's an issue which people are not aware of. Anyway,
I think you have to. You're absolutely right. Conveying a nuanced argument to maybe a poorly educated Reform UK voter
is going to be difficult.
It's going to be tricky. It's not going to be easy. But I think the Green Party is doing pretty well in terms of saying that if Reform UK fail to tackle climate change, if they don't do anything about it, then we will see billions of people on the move. And if you want that, then vote for Reform UK, because they will give you that.
Yeah. That's the way to pose it. Worldwide, millions, if not billions of people will be on the move in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And the whole argument about nation states, about immigration controls just disappears, because it's going to be impossible to kind of hold borders in that way. When the mass movements of migration, immigration controls almost become irrelevant. And we have to look at then ways of how do we create societies which from everybody that's in a particular area, whether they're moving in or moving out. But anyway, is there any more questions, contributions? that people want to make, please wave or indicate using the share button. Otherwise, I will wind down the meeting. Any more final points that people want to make? No, I think we've come to the end then, John. And I just want to say I'm going to stop the recording now.